Picture this. It's a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1991. The air in a small Ohio town smells like cut grass and charcoal smoke, and the kind of lazy, forgettable afternoon that you never think twice about, until the moment it becomes the one afternoon you will spend the rest of your life trying to forget. A woman named Sandra steps out her back door. She has a laundry basket under one arm. She's a little tired. She's always a little tired. That's what having a 2-year-old does to you. It installs a permanent, low-grade exhaustion that hums behind your eyes like a fluorescent bulb that won't quite turn off, no matter how much sleep you get, no matter how much coffee you drink. She walks to the clothesline along the back fence. She starts pulling down sheets. She folds them the way you fold laundry when you're not really thinking about it. Automatically, mechanically, her eyes soft and unfocused, her mind somewhere neutral. It takes 4 minutes. Maybe 5. She turns around. The yard is empty. Her son, Michael, 2 years old, dark eyes, wide smile, obsessed with trucks, unable to correctly pronounce the word spaghetti, owner of a stuffed elephant named Gray and a red rubber ball that was, at that moment, still sitting in the grass where he had been playing with it, is simply gone. The red ball is still there. The grass is still dented where he was sitting. The gate in the fence is still latched. He is not there. Sandra drops the basket. She calls his name. Once, softly, like maybe she just missed him somehow. Then louder. Then in that full-lunged, raw, terrifying way that the human voice only reaches when the human body has understood something that the mind hasn't caught up with yet. She runs to the front yard. She runs to the street. She beats on the neighbor's door. She screams his name until her voice breaks. Michael is gone. And over the next 3 years, a team of detectives, FBI agents, forensic specialists, and hundreds of volunteers will pour everything they have into finding him, following leads across 4 states, interviewing thousands of people, and generating a case file that runs to thousands of pages. And they will come up empty. Every single time. The answer, when it finally came, did not arrive through a database or a DNA match or a surveillance camera. It did not come from a detective or a federal agent or a career investigator with 17 years on the job. It came from a 5-year-old girl sitting at a kitchen table with a box of crayons. A little girl with paint-stained fingers who, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, looked up from her drawing and said something so specific, so impossible to fabricate, so deeply, chillingly precise, that it broke open a cold case that had gone silent for 3 years. And what she said began with 4 words. I remember the man. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is one of the most haunting, extraordinary, and ultimately redemptive stories I have ever told on this channel. And I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. To understand what happened to Michael Carver, you first have to understand who Michael Carver was. Because in cases like this, it's easy for the victim to become reduced to their photograph, to be frozen forever as a face on a missing person's flyer, two-dimensional and static, stripped of everything that made them a living, breathing, irreplaceable human being. Michael was not a photograph. He was a person. He was born on March 14, 1989, at St. Joseph's Medical Center in Hargrove, Ohio. He came into the world at 6:47 in the morning, which his mother Sandra always said explained a lot about him, because he was, for his entire short life at home, inexplicably, infuriatingly cheerful before 9 a.m. While Sandra was barely functional until her second cup of coffee, Michael would wake up talking, already in the middle of some energetic project that only he understood, demanding breakfast and trucks and attention with the relentless optimism of someone who had not yet been informed that mornings were not supposed to be enjoyed. His father, Dale Carver, was a line supervisor at a manufacturing plant about 12 miles from their house on Elmwood Court. Dale was a big, quiet man, the kind of man who communicated more through actions than words, who expressed love through fixed appliances and mowed lawns and the particular brand of focused attention he gave to his son on weekend afternoons when he'd get down on the floor and play trucks for hours without complaint. Michael had his father's dark eyes, deep-set and watchful even when the rest of his face was doing something completely ridiculous, which it frequently was. Sandra was a dental hygienist who had taken a leave of absence when Michael was born, planning to return once he started preschool. She was the talker of the household, the planner, the one who remembered birthdays and kept track of doctor's appointments and initiated difficult conversations with a combination of warmth and directness that the people who loved her found either wonderful or exhausting depending on the day. She was, by every account from everyone who knew her, a devoted, attentive, intelligent mother. They lived in a 2-bedroom house at 14 Elmwood Court, a quiet cul-de-sac in a quiet neighborhood in a quiet town. Chain-link fences, American flags, kids' bikes in driveways. The kind of street where people waved to each other in the morning and genuinely meant it. Michael's grandmother, Evelyn Carver, gave interviews about him for years after his disappearance, and what was striking about those interviews was how precisely she described him. Not in vague, sentimental terms, but in the particular details that only someone who truly knew a person reaches for. She talked about his laugh, how it sounded like bells, she said, like someone was shaking a glass jar full of bells, and how once he started, you couldn't help yourself, you just started too. She talked about how he ate his cereal dry and refused to wear shoes from approximately March through October, and how he had recently discovered climbing, which had resulted in a full rearrangement of the furniture in the living room and the installation of 2 new baby gates. She talked about how he called spaghetti but sketty, and how he named every vehicle he encountered, car, bus, garbage truck, the mail van, simply truck, because that was a good enough word, and why would you need another one? She talked about Gray, the stuffed elephant, worn down to almost nothing from being loved so hard, missing one eye. Michael slept with it pressed against his face every night. Gray was found in his room after he disappeared, right where he'd left it. Sandra's sister Patrice lived about 20 minutes away with her husband and their daughter, Emma. Emma had been born just 8 months before Michael, which meant the 2 cousins had grown up in each other's orbit from the very beginning. At every family dinner, every holiday, every Sunday afternoon in Evelyn's backyard. They had developed the particular bond of children who have always known each other, who take each other's existence as a given, as natural and unremarkable as the sun. Emma called Michael Mikey M.O. He called her M. Neither of them could correctly pronounce the other's name, and so they had arrived at these small, private syllables, and Sandra used to say watching them together was like watching 2 people who had invented their own language and were perfectly happy to live inside it. The summer of 1991, up until August 18th, had been a genuinely good one. Dale had gotten a raise. They were talking about maybe looking for a bigger house, a 3-bedroom, maybe with more yard, maybe with room for a swing set. Sandra had rejoined a book club. Michael had discovered the garden hose as a personal entertainment system and had spent most of June and July in a state of joyful, permanent dampness. By every measure available, life was good. And then it wasn't. Let's go back to August 18th, 1991. A Sunday. The day that Sandra Carver would spend the rest of her life turning over in her hands like a stone she could never put down, examining it from every angle, looking for the moment where it could have gone differently, where she could have made a different choice that would have led to a different afternoon, a different world. The day started ordinarily. Dale was on an overtime shift. The plant was behind on a production contract and had asked for weekend volunteers, and they needed the extra money toward the Newhouse Fund. Sandra was up with Michael at 7, made his oatmeal, watched him spend 20 minutes sculpting it into what he clearly believed were architectural masterpieces before consuming approximately 4 bites, and then let him watch his cartoon videos while she cleaned up the kitchen. They went outside mid-morning. This was their routine when the weather was good. Michael in the backyard while Sandra worked. The yard at 14, Elmwood Court, was fully fenced. Dale had put in the chain-link fence himself the previous spring, specifically and deliberately for this purpose, so that Michael could be outside without being in the street. It was 4 feet high, which was perfectly adequate for keeping a 2-year-old contained, because a 2-year-old cannot climb a 4-foot chain-link fence. The gate on the left side of the yard had a sliding bolt latch mounted high enough that Michael would have needed to be roughly twice his actual height to reach it. Sandra checked the gate that morning. She would repeat this detail to police more times than she could count over the following days and weeks and months. She had checked the gate. The latch was secure. Around 2 in the afternoon, Sandra had brought Michael in for his afternoon nap. He didn't always nap anymore. He was at that transitional age where some days he needed it and some days he simply wouldn't, and you couldn't always tell in advance which kind of day it was going to be. This day he did nap. Sandra rested herself for about 40 minutes, which was as much as she ever allowed herself, even when she was exhausted. When Michael woke up around 3:30, she brought him back outside. The laundry had been on the line since morning, and she wanted to get it down before the clouds building on the western horizon reached them. She set Michael down in the grass with his red ball, slightly deflated, slightly lopsided, one of his absolute favorites in a rotating cast of beloved objects. The clothesline ran along the back fence, about 20 feet from where he was sitting. She turned her back. 4 minutes. She would estimate 4 minutes to herself for the rest of her life, turning that number over, examining it, wondering if it was right. 4 minutes. Maybe 5. The kind of time that passes without you noticing it passing because nothing has ever happened in 4 minutes before. Nothing ever does, until suddenly it does. She turned around. Michael was gone. The red ball was still in the grass, still slightly dented from where he had been sitting on it, like a small ghost impression of his weight. The gate was still latched. The fence was intact. The yard was simply empty. Sandra called his name. She called it again. She walked to the far corner of the yard and looked behind the bushes. She went to the gate and looked through it at the street. She went inside and checked every room. She went to the front yard. She ran to the neighbors. She knocked on doors. She called his name until she had no voice left for anything but a whisper. She called 911 at 3:48 p.m. The dispatcher, a woman named Brenda Hutchins, said later that she had been doing that job for 11 years and she could hear things in people's voices that she had learned to trust. Sandra's voice, she said, had gone completely flat. Not crying, not screaming, just flat. The way a voice gets when the body has understood that screaming won't help but doesn't know yet what will. "My son is missing from my backyard," Sandra said. "He's 2 years old. I need someone here right now." The first officer arrived at 14 Elmwood Court at 3:54 p.m. Within an hour there were 12 patrol units, a K-9 team, and the beginning of a neighborhood search that would grow, over the next several days, to involve more than 300 volunteers. The dogs picked up a scent. They followed it approximately 30 feet from the red ball. And then they stopped. Like the scent had simply ended. Like whatever trail existed had been cut off, erased. They found nothing else. No physical evidence. No witnesses. No trace. Michael Carver had vanished from a locked backyard in broad daylight on a Sunday afternoon in a neighborhood full of people, and no one had seen a single thing. The lead investigator assigned to the Michael Carver disappearance was Detective Ray Hollis. 17 years in law enforcement, the last 9 in the sheriff's department. He had worked missing persons cases before. He had seen things that left marks on him. But he would later say, and say more than once, that the scene at 14 Elmwood Court was unlike anything he had encountered in his career, not because it was dramatic or violent or disturbing in the conventional sense, but because it was impossible. Not difficult. Not unlikely. Physically, structurally, evidentiarily impossible. Here was the problem. The chain-link fence was intact. All 4 sides, including the gate, were intact and showed no signs of forced entry or exit. The soft soil running along the fence line, the kind of loose, slightly damp garden soil that holds a footprint like wet clay, was undisturbed. 15 feet of it along each side of the fence, and not a single mark that could be identified as a footprint. The 3 kitchen windows in neighboring houses that had sight lines into the yard, Hollis checked every one, were positioned such that a person climbing the fence would have been visible from at least 2 of them. And yet, Sandra had been at the clothesline, which was at the back of the yard, facing away from Michael's position. She would not have seen someone approach the left side of the fence. The windows, Hollis confirmed later, were currently visible, but on that Sunday afternoon, one of them had been obscured by a hanging curtain, and the family in another had been watching a movie with the blinds partially down. The third house, to the direct left, had no one home. So visibility was not the ironclad alibi it had first appeared to be. Still, the fence, the undisturbed soil, the intact gate. From a purely physical standpoint, Hollis wrote in his case notes, the scene is inconsistent with an unassisted exit by a 26-month-old child. It is also inconsistent with an adult entering and exiting the yard while carrying a child without leaving trace evidence. What we have is a scene that appears, on its face, impossible. The FBI was called in at the 72-hour mark. Special Agent Lorena Vasquez was assigned to the case, and she would remain connected to it, in one form or another, for the next decade. Vasquez was methodical in the way of someone who had decided long ago that thoroughness was the only hedge against regret. Her colleagues called her the auditor because of the way she went through case files, line by line, item by item, as if looking for a calculation error that everyone else had missed. In the first week, the investigation fanned out in every direction at once. Every resident on Elmwood Court and the 2 adjacent streets was interviewed. Every business within a half-mile radius was canvassed. Surveillance cameras, rare in 1991, were checked. The nearest one, a bank ATM 2 blocks away, had captured nothing useful. Dale's alibi was confirmed independently by 5 co-workers and a time-stamped clock-in sheet. Sandra's background, her relationships, her finances, all examined, all clean. The sex offender registry for the county. The national databases. Known offenders who had been active in the region. All of it. Nothing. Michael's face went on the evening news the night of his disappearance. By the end of the first week, it had been picked up nationally. His photo, that June snapshot Sandra had taken of him grinning at the camera, mouth slightly open like he was just about to say something, dark eyes bright and delighted by something just out of frame, ran in newspapers across the country. Hundreds of tips came in. Dozens of reported sightings. Families from Ohio to California called in to say they had seen a small dark-haired boy at a gas station, at a rest stop, at a diner, at a church parking lot. Every single one was followed up. Every single one dissolved on contact with reality. By October of 1991, with no physical evidence, no suspects, no leads with any credibility, the active search was formally scaled back. The case was classified as an open investigation, which, in practice, meant 1 part-time detective and a filing cabinet. For all intents and purposes, the trail was dead, and the Carver family was left alone with the worst possible companion in the world, not knowing. There is a kind of suffering that has no clean name. Grief has a name. Hope has a name. But the thing that lives in the space between those 2 words, the thing families of missing children carry when there has been no body, no confirmation, no final answer, that thing doesn't have a word in English adequate to describe it. The French have one, dual blanc. White grief. Grief for someone who is gone but might not be gone. Grief that cannot complete itself because it has nothing solid to attach to. Sandra Carver carried that for 3 years. In the first months, she did what families of missing children do. She maintained the tip line. She coordinated with search organizations. She appeared on television when they would have her. She accepted offers of help with a kind of focused, ferocious practicality. She needed to be useful, needed to be moving, because stopping would mean the world had stopped, and the world stopping was not something she was prepared to allow. Michael's room stayed exactly as it was. His clothes were washed and folded and put back in his dresser. His toys were on the shelf. Gray the elephant sat on his pillow, in case he came back. Because he might come back. Dale went quieter. He went back to work. He fixed things around the house that didn't particularly need fixing. He was not a man who had ever had easy access to his own emotional interior, and the magnitude of what had happened was simply beyond the vocabulary he had available to describe it. He and Sandra talked about Michael constantly, but couldn't always talk to each other about Michael, not directly, not honestly. The grief was too enormous and too raw, and they kept accidentally hurting each other with it. By early 1992, the marriage was fracturing. By summer, Dale had moved out. They never formally divorced. The paperwork would have felt like one finality too many, one more thing closed when the most important thing was still open. But they lived separately, and they grieved separately, and they each carried the not knowing alone. Sandra's anchor was her sister Patrice. Patrice came over every morning, or called, or both. She brought food. She sat in the specific silence of someone who knows that there is nothing to say and has given up pretending otherwise. And she brought Emma. Emma, who was not quite 2 when Michael disappeared. Emma, who was too small to understand what had happened, but old enough to feel the weight of the sadness that had settled over the adults around her. Emma, who became in those visits a small, energetic ambassador of ordinary life, demanding to be read to, showing off drawings, insisting on games with a toddler's magnificent obliviousness to how much her aliveness was breaking and healing Sandra's heart at the same time. Emma called Michael Mikey M.O. when his name came up, which it did, the way young children reference things matter-of-factly without understanding that their matter-of-factness is devastating. "Where's Mikey M.O.?" she would sometimes ask. And Sandra would say he was somewhere else today, and Emma would accept this with a child's trusting lack of follow-up, and Sandra would excuse herself for a minute and go to a room where she could breathe. The holidays came and went. They were observed but not celebrated, which is a very different thing. Michael's place at the table was neither set nor cleared. It existed in the imagination, a ghost space that everyone circled around without naming. Evelyn, Michael's grandmother, kept buying Christmas presents for him and wrapping them and putting them under her tree. Just in case. Just so they would be there, if he came back, if it turned out he had just been somewhere else, somewhere they hadn't thought to look. 3 Christmas seasons passed. The presents accumulated. The trail went cold and stayed cold. And Emma grew from almost 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, learning to talk and draw and write her name and argue with authority and fall off bikes and sing songs, acquiring the full and busy personhood of a growing child, carrying with her, somewhere in the deep storage of her early memory, something she didn't yet have the right words for. Something she had seen. Something she had watched happen, from less than 30 feet away, on a Sunday afternoon in August 1991, when she was 20 months old. Something that nobody had ever thought to ask her about. Because she had been 20 months old. Who asks a 20-month-old what they saw? Before I go further, I need to pause here for a moment. Because what happens next in this story is the kind of thing that, when you hear it, sounds like it belongs in a movie. It sounds too perfect, too dramatically calibrated, too neatly timed. And I want to be straight with you about something. The reason it sounds like a movie is not because it was invented. It's because real life, occasionally, arranges itself into moments that are genuinely, astonishingly cinematic. And when it does, the honest thing is to just tell it straight and let it be what it is. But to understand why what Emma said was credible, why the investigators who heard it took it seriously rather than dismissing it, you need to understand something about how children's memories actually work. Because the common wisdom most of us carry about infant memory is significantly wrong. The conventional assumption goes something like this: children under 3 can't form durable memories. Their brains aren't developed enough. Whatever happened to them before age 3 or 4 is gone, covered over by what developmental psychologists call infantile amnesia, the near-universal inability of adults to access memories from their very early childhood. You probably can't remember your second birthday. Almost nobody can. Therefore, a 20-month-old couldn't have retained a meaningful memory of a specific event. That assumption is wrong. Or more precisely, it's incomplete. What researchers have been finding through the late 1980s and early 1990s, and what a developmental psychologist named Dr. Patricia Michelson had been specifically documenting in her work, was that the brain doesn't process all memories equally. Most everyday experience gets compressed and then faded, which is why you can't remember most Tuesdays from 10 years ago. But events that carry emotional weight, events that frighten, confuse, or profoundly surprise a child, get processed differently. They get encoded more deeply. They lay down traces that are not the same as a fully articulated narrative memory, but are more than nothing. Much more than nothing. Dr. Michelson called these anchor memories. Her research had documented dozens of cases where children, at ages 4, 5, and 6, had produced accurate accounts of events they had experienced before age 2, not as complete, coherent stories, but as sensory fragments, emotional impressions, and specific concrete details that could be verified against objective facts. A child who described the color of a room they had not been in since the age of 18 months. A child who named a family member by a nickname they had not heard in 3 years. A child who described a specific physical sensation associated with an event their parents had thought was well outside the range of possible recall. The key was in how the memory was accessed. Forced recall, adults asking, "Do you remember when?" produced unreliable results because the child's desire to please or their suggestibility to adult framing could contaminate whatever genuine memory existed. But spontaneous recall, triggered by something in the present environment, a sight, a sound, a smell, a combination of sensory cues, could produce startlingly precise material. Because the memory wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for the right key. Emma's key, it turned out, was a box of crayons and a Tuesday afternoon and whatever synaptic chain fired when she picked up the red one. It was a Tuesday in late September 1994. Emma was 5 years and 1 month old. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her parents' house, doing what she did most afternoons after preschool, drawing. Emma had an elaborate and completely self-confident artistic life at 5. She generated enormous quantities of crayon work with the absolute conviction of someone who has not yet encountered the concept of a critic. Every piece was a masterpiece in the moment of its creation and was then either given away or discarded with equal lack of sentimentality. On this afternoon she was drawing what she told her mother was a picture of when I was little. Patrice was at the kitchen counter making dinner, half listening the way parents learn to half listen when their children narrate their creative process, which is essentially always. Emma drew in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, in a completely flat, conversational tone, the tone of someone reporting something they assume their listener already knows. "Mommy, I remember when the man took Mikey M.O." Patrice's knife stopped. "What did you say, baby?" she asked. Her voice came out more carefully than she intended. Emma didn't look up from her drawing. "The man," she said, "who came over the fence. He had on a red shirt. And he picked up Mikey M.O. and he went over the fence again. And Mikey M.O. was doing the crying face. The quiet kind. The room was very still. Patrice turned around. Slowly. The way you move when you are afraid that moving too fast will break something fragile that you didn't know was there until this second. Emma, she said. Sweetheart, tell Mommy more about that. Emma selected a different crayon. He had black hair, she said. Like pieces. Short pieces. She demonstrated by holding her fingers up near her own head, spacing them apart in a way that suggested a short, choppy cut, maybe a buzz cut growing out. And a red shirt, with something written on it. I couldn't read it. I didn't know how to read yet. Patrice sat down at the table. Emma continued coloring. He had a truck, she said. A van truck. A white one. It was in front of Sandra's house. And he put Mikey Mo in it, and then he drove away. You saw this, Patrice said. Her voice was almost a whisper. You were there, Emma? At Sandra's house. Emma looked up at her then, with those direct, uncomplicated eyes that 5-year-olds have before they've learned to calculate the effect of their honesty. I was in the yard, she said. Me and Mikey Mo were playing with the red ball. I was there. And that was when Patrice's brain made the connection that should have been made 3 years and 1 month earlier, the connection that no one had made because no one had thought to look for it. They had been at Sandra's house all the time that summer, multiple times a week. Emma and Michael played in that backyard constantly. It was entirely possible, more than possible, it was simply likely, that Patrice had dropped Emma off that afternoon, or that she and Sandra had been together earlier and Emma had stayed, or any one of a dozen routine arrangements that nobody had tracked because it was a normal summer afternoon and nobody was tracking such things. Nobody had ever asked Emma what she saw. She was 20 months old. Nobody thought to ask a 20-month-old. Patrice's hands were shaking when she picked up the phone. She called Detective Ray Hollis directly. She had his number because she had called him enough times over 3 years that it had transferred from the official case card to her own personal memory. He answered on the second ring. This is Patrice Alderman, she said. Sandra's sister. I need you to listen to me very carefully. And I need you not to dismiss what I'm about to say because of how it sounds. Ray Hollis had received, by his own later estimate, somewhere between 600 and 700 tips related to the Michael Carver case over the course of 3 years. Tips from psychics. Tips from neighbors who had decided in retrospect that so-and-so had always seemed shifty. Tips from people who had dreamed about the case and were certain their dream was meaningful. Tips from people who had seen the photo on a bulletin board at a post office and experienced a conviction of recognition they couldn't explain. He had followed every credible one. He had followed some he didn't believe were credible because you couldn't afford to leave anything unchecked. And he had arrived, gradually and painfully, at a state of professional exhaustion with the case, the particular hopeless fatigue of an investigator who has been thorough and careful and relentless and who has still come up with nothing. But something about the way Patrice said don't dismiss this made him pick up a pen. He listened without interrupting. He was good at listening. He had learned that the most important thing a detective could do, when someone was telling you something, was to stop the part of your brain that was already planning a response and simply hear what was being said. When Patrice finished, he asked one question. How long ago did she say this? About 15 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Patrice, I need you to do something very specific. I need you to not ask Emma any more questions. Not one. I need you to go back to the table and be completely normal with her. Talk about her drawing, make dinner, don't reference anything she just told you. Can you do that? I can try. You need to do more than try. If you ask her questions, if you phrase anything in a way that suggests what you want her to say, it could compromise what we have. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, she said. I understand. I'm going to call someone, and we are going to come and speak to Emma tonight, properly, in a way that protects whatever she has in her memory. Don't tell Sandra yet. I know that's hard, but not yet. Can you give me 2 hours? Yes. He hung up and sat for one moment with his hand still on the receiver. Then he opened his address book to the M section and found a slightly faded entry, a name transferred from a business card 3 years earlier because something she'd said had lodged itself in him and refused to leave. Dr. Patricia Michelson, University of Cincinnati. Child Developmental Psychology. He had attended a training seminar in 1991, the summer before Michael disappeared, as a mandatory professional development obligation that most of his colleagues had forgotten within a week. He remembered it. He remembered it because this woman had stood in front of a room full of detectives and said something he had written on an index card and kept. The most dangerous assumption a law enforcement officer can make about a child witness, she had said, is that they have nothing to say because they were too young to understand what they saw. Children don't need to understand something to remember it. He had the card somewhere. He remembered writing it. Dr. Michelson answered on the 4th ring. He told her the name of the case. There was a pause. I know that case, she said. I have a 5-year-old who I believe witnessed the disappearance when she was 20 months old. She produced a spontaneous account approximately 30 minutes ago. It's detailed. I haven't heard it directly yet, but from the relay I just received, it includes physical descriptions, vehicle description, method of entry to the scene. I need a forensic interview conducted tonight, before she sleeps, before anyone talks to her further. Another pause. Longer. I'll come tonight, she said. Give me the address. Dr. Patricia Michelson arrived at Patrice and her husband's house at 7:15 that evening. She was a composed woman in her mid-40s, with a kind of calm that was not coldness, but the practiced stillness of someone who spent her professional life in rooms where the wrong energy could break something irreplaceable. She carried a small bag and a tote full of art supplies and toys that she used in her work with children, and she took 15 minutes alone with Patrice to establish the ground rules and the protocol before she went anywhere near Emma. Detective Hollis observed from an adjacent room through a viewing arrangement Patrice had consented to. A video camera recorded the session. Sandra Carver was not present. This had been Hollis's call, and it was the right one. The presence of Michael's mother, even sitting silently in a corner, carried an emotional gravity that could pull Emma's account in directions she might otherwise not go. Dr. Michelson had conducted over 300 forensic interviews with children in her career. She was extraordinary at it in the particular way of people whose technique is invisible. You couldn't see the expertise because it wore the costume of natural conversation. She sat on the floor. She spent 10 minutes looking at Emma's drawings with what was clearly genuine interest, asking Emma to explain specific elements, listening to the explanations with full attention, responding with the uncomplicated appreciation of someone who found the drawings genuinely interesting. She talked about preschool. She talked about Emma's stuffed animals. She talked about what Emma had eaten for dinner with that relaxed, wandering conversational quality that put children at ease in ways that purposeful questioning never could. Then, with a gentleness so smooth you almost couldn't track the moment it happened, she said, "Your mom mentioned you were talking about something you remembered from when you were really little. I'd love to hear about that, if you feel like telling me." Emma considered this for a moment. She was deliberate for a 5-year-old. You could actually see her organizing her thoughts, which was unusual. "About Mikey M.O., she said. "Tell me," Dr. Michelson said. That was all. Just tell me. What followed was 47 minutes. 47 minutes that were painstaking and slow and frequently circuitous in the way of young children's speech, looping back, jumping forward, requiring gentle redirections and long patient silences while Emma found her way back to the thread. Dr. Michelson never led her, never suggested a detail, never said, "Was it this?" or "Did you see that?" She simply created space, and she waited, and Emma filled it. Emma described being in the backyard at Sandra's house with Michael. They were playing with the red ball. She described the ball as his red one, a little flat, which was precise. Sandra was at the clothesline, which Emma placed correctly at the back of the yard, and Emma said she was facing away, getting the sheets. A man came over the fence. Not through the gate, over the fence. On the left side. He was big, she said. He had short hair like pieces. He was wearing a red shirt with writing on it, but I don't know what it said. He walked across the yard to Michael. What did Michael do? Dr. Michelson asked. Emma thought. He looked at him, she said, and then he made the crying face, but the quiet kind. Like when you fall down and it really hurts but you're not going to cry out loud. She demonstrated this expression, the chin trembling, the eyes going glassy, with the precise recall of a child who had watched it happen and registered it completely. The man picked Michael up. He walked back to the fence and went over it again. Emma had watched all of this. She had not called out. She had not cried. She had stood and watched, 20 months old, the width of a front lawn away. Why didn't you call for Sandra? Dr. Michelson asked. Emma looked slightly abashed. I thought he was his daddy, she said. When grown-ups come and pick you up, it's usually your daddy. And I didn't really know his daddy. I thought it was him. 20 months old. Using the logic available to her. Assuming the world was making sense. She described going to the gate afterward and looking through it at the street. The man was putting Michael into the van truck. White. On the side there was something like a picture, but she couldn't tell more than that. The man got in and drove away. And then Sandra turned around and said Mikey M.O.'s name, and I said it too because I didn't know where he went. She paused. I thought maybe he was just somewhere I couldn't see. In the adjacent room, Ray Hollis was writing on index cards with a hand that was not entirely steady. White van. Red shirt. Black hair. Short. Came over the left side of the fence. Logo or image on the side of the van. He wrote those down. Then he wrote one more thing on a separate card, capitalized, underlined. She doesn't know about the fence. Let me explain why those 4 words, "She doesn't know about the fence," were the most important 4 words Ray Hollis wrote that evening. In the initial forensic examination of 14 Elmwood Court, conducted on August 18th and 19th of 1991, the crime scene technicians had documented a small detail on the left side of the chain-link fence. On the top rail, the horizontal metal bar that ran along the top of the fence, they had found a trace amount of biological material. Skin cells and trace fluid consistent with a scrape or abrasion. Not enough for meaningful analysis with 1991 technology. Not enough to build on. But it was there, and it had been collected, catalogued, and stored. This detail had never been released to the public. Standard investigative practice: you always hold something back, something that only a genuine witness or a genuine perpetrator could know. The biological trace on the fence rail had been the held-back detail in the Michael Carver case. Every detective on the case knew about it. Nobody outside law enforcement did. And Emma, in her 3rd session with Dr. Michelson, mentioned it without being asked. It came up as an almost afterthought, in response to a broad, open-ended question about whether there was anything else she remembered. She paused for a long moment, looking at the middle distance in that unfocused way children look when they are actually accessing something rather than constructing it. "He hurt his hand," she said. "Who did?" "The man. When he went over the fence. He put his hand on the top, and he made a face like it hurt." She pressed the back of her own hand against an imaginary surface. "Like when the fence is hot from the sun and you touch it." Then she went back to the drawing she'd been working on. In the adjacent room, Hollis was completely still. She hadn't described a cut. She hadn't described bleeding. She had described the involuntary reaction, the wince, the face, of someone whose hand made unexpected contact with a surface. A scrape. A metal rail dragged across the heel of a palm as a man swung himself over a fence with a child in his other arm. She had been 20 months old. She had been standing 30 feet away. And she had watched, and she had registered, with the complete and unjudging precision of a child's observation, a man wince when his hand hit the top of a chain-link fence. There was no way she had been told about the biological trace. There was no way she had read about it. There was no way she had constructed it. A 20-month-old who watched a man come over a fence, watched him react to hurting his hand, and filed it away in whatever deep memory vault stores the things that don't make sense yet but get kept anyway. That was not suggestion. That was not confabulation. That was witnessing. Hollis drove home at 11:30 that night and sat in his parked car in his own driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. He was a man of controlled emotion by training and by disposition. He had learned not to invest too much of himself in any single development in a long, cold case, because the ground had shifted too many times before and he had fallen too many times with it. But he sat in that car, and he thought about a red ball in the grass, and about a 2-year-old boy who had called everything a truck. And he let himself believe, just briefly, that maybe this was the thing that would finally matter. Ray Hollis officially reopened the active investigation into Michael Carver's disappearance on October 3, 1994. He did it quietly, no press release, no announcement. He had learned over 3 years that public attention on a cold case could be as damaging as helpful, sending witnesses into hiding and giving subjects time to prepare. He started with the white van. Going back through the original neighborhood canvas from August 1991, Hollis and his team reviewed every statement with new, specific eyes, looking for any mention of a white vehicle in the Elmwood Court area that afternoon. The original canvas had been thorough, but it had not been directed. Officers had asked generally about unusual activity without a specific vehicle description to anchor to. But now, reading back through those notes, something surfaced. A retired postal worker named Eugene Ferris, who lived on the street adjacent to Elmwood Court, had mentioned in his original statement that he had noticed a white vehicle parked near the curb that afternoon. He had been outside watering his plants. He noted it because it was parked in the hydrant clearance zone, which was his particular grievance with the neighborhood's parking habits, and he had thought about calling the city, but the vehicle was gone when he looked again a little while later. His statement from 1991 read, "White van, cargo style, medium-sized. Had something on the side, a logo of some kind, I think, though I didn't look closely. Couldn't tell you the plates. Parked maybe 10 to 15 minutes, then gone." In 1991, this detail had been recorded and filed with the hundreds of other pieces of mild, unactionable peripheral information that accumulate in a major investigation. No vehicle match. No plates. No description specific enough to run. It had gone into the cabinet. Now Hollis went back to Eugene Ferris. The man was 71 by this point, slightly frilier than he'd been 3 years earlier, but his memory was sharp and he was deeply glad to be asked. "White van," Ferris said. "Medium-sized. A working van, not a passenger van, the kind that has the company's name on the side. I remember thinking it was probably someone doing a service call on a Sunday, which struck me as odd. The logo on the side was dark, navy or black. I didn't read it, I just registered there was something there." One detail that had not made it into his original statement, which he now offered because the detectives were asking more specifically, there was a name, part of a name, on the driver's door, like the driver's name or a company abbreviation. Starts with a K, I think, or maybe a C. Hard letters to tell apart at a distance. Hollis put that on an index card. Meanwhile, Dr. Michelson's full report on Emma's testimony had been completed and submitted. 22 pages. Her conclusion was stated carefully, as any scientist's must be, but unmistakably, Emma's account demonstrated the characteristics of genuine recall. The core elements were consistent across 3 sessions, while peripheral details showed the natural variation of authentic memory rather than rehearsed recitation. Her knowledge of the biological trace on the fence rail, which she had not described as blood or injury but as a physical reaction to unexpected contact, was consistent only with direct observation. Special Agent Vasquez, back on the case after Hollis's call, submitted the biological material from the fence rail for reanalysis with updated techniques. In 1994, DNA analysis was more advanced than it had been in 1991, though still far from the tool it would become. What they got was partial. But partial was something. A male contributor. Unknown. No match in any current database. But it existed. It was real. It could be matched, if they ever found someone to match it to. Hollis had 3 things now that he hadn't had 3 years before: a confirmed witness account, a partial DNA profile, and a partial vehicle description that was beginning to solidify. It wasn't enough. But it was finally something. The investigation moved on multiple tracks simultaneously through the winter of 1994 and into 1995. On the vehicle track, Hollis's team compiled a list of white cargo vans registered in the county and the 4 surrounding counties as of August 1991. Ohio vehicle records from that period were incomplete. Some small operators registered commercial vehicles through their businesses rather than personally, and some of those businesses no longer existed. But they worked through it methodically. The fairest description: white cargo van, navy or black logo on the side, partial letter K or C on the driver's door, parked on the street adjacent to 14 Elmwood Court for 10 to 15 minutes on the afternoon of August 18th, gave them parameters to work with. Over 12 weeks, they identified and eliminated 47 vehicles. They spoke to 33 drivers and operators. They pulled business registration records for companies that had used white cargo fleets in the region in 1991. On the 38th interview, something shifted. A former employee of a now-defunct HVAC maintenance company spoke to investigators at his current job. He had worked for the company, Caswell Mechanical Services, white vans, Navy K logo, driver names stenciled on the cab doors, in the summer of 1991. He didn't remember August 18th specifically, he said. But he remembered something else. He remembered one of the drivers being talked about among the other employees after the news about the missing Carver boy came out. There was a guy, he said. We called him Carl. Carl Beaumont. He worked there that summer. Seasonal, came in around May, left around September. He used to park in residential areas on his lunch breaks sometimes, which was against company policy. He lived alone, kind of a loner. After the news broke about the kid, a couple of the guys were talking, and someone mentioned that Beaumont had been acting strange around that time. Edgy. He quit not long after, just didn't show up one day. I don't know what happened to him. Carl Beaumont. On the driver's door of a Caswell Mechanical Services van, stenciled in block letters, C. Beaumont. From a distance, in a moment, C could look like a K. Hollis pulled the employment records for Caswell Mechanical Services, still archived through the State Labor Board. Carl David Beaumont. Date of birth, November 3, 1961. Hired May 1991. Last day worked, August 20th, 1991. 2 days after Michael Carver disappeared. Last known address, a rental property in a town called Mill Creek, 45 minutes east of Hargrove. Finding Carl Beaumont took 6 weeks and 3 false addresses. He had moved several times since 1991. He had worked a series of short-term positions, seasonal, manual labor, the kind of employment that doesn't always generate paperwork or stay in systems. He had no criminal record in Ohio, which meant he hadn't been in any database that investigators had checked in 1991. He was not on the sex offender registry, because before August 18, 1991, he had never been convicted of anything. When Hollis and Agent Vasquez finally located him, in February 1995, he was living in a single-wide mobile home about 40 miles from where he'd grown up, working a part-time landscaping job. He was 33 years old. He was alone. The moment Hollis saw him, this is something Hollis would recount more than once in later years, he thought of a phrase that Emma had used in her forensic interview. Big arms. Emma had said the man had big arms. Carl Beaumont was not a large man in his overall frame, but he was powerfully built in the arms and shoulders from years of physical labor, and it was the first thing you noticed about him. Black hair. Short and choppy, growing out from what might have been a buzz cut. The interview had been 3.5 years after the event, and the hair had grown, but the bone structure and coloring matched Emma's description with a precision that Hollis kept to himself for now. Beaumont was cooperative. Superficially, the way people who are practiced at appearing cooperative are cooperative. He said he didn't remember much about that summer. He said he'd left Caswell because of a better offer elsewhere, though he couldn't name the company. He said he barely remembered working in the Hargrove area. He said the name Michael Carver meant nothing to him. But he was also, in ways that Hollis catalogued quietly during the interview, wrong. His eyes were wrong. His hands were wrong. He'd put them flat on the table early in the conversation and didn't move them, the particular stillness of someone who has trained themselves not to move their hands. He answered questions slightly faster than naturally paced speech, as if the answers were stored and waiting rather than being produced in real time. And there was something else. On the inside of his right forearm, partially visible beneath his sleeve as he had reached across the table once, was a scar. Horizontal. About 2.5 inches long. Old enough to be white rather than pink. Healed. Consistent with a sharp edge rather than a blunt impact. Consistent with a chain-link fence rail, if someone had swung hard over it on a Sunday afternoon in August. Hollis thanked him for his time and did not let any of what he was thinking show on his face. Outside, in the parking lot, Vasquez said, "Him." Hollis said, "I know. We need the DNA. I know that too." Getting Carl Beaumont's DNA was not straightforward. In 1995, the law around compelling DNA samples from individuals who were not yet formally charged was complicated and in flux. They needed to do it right. A bad collection, a tainted chain of custody, a procedural error, could poison the case before it started, and Hollis was not going to let that happen. They used the method that had become standard practice for exactly these situations. They waited. Beaumont stopped for coffee at a diner in his town 3 times a week. On the second visit after Hollis began watching him, Beaumont left a coffee cup on the table. A detective posing as another diner took possession of it. The cup was bagged, labeled, and transported to the state crime lab within 4 hours. The sample was partial, as the fence rail sample had been. Partial but viable. The comparison took 9 days. On the 9th day, Hollis's phone rang and the lab technician on the other end said, "Detective Hollis, we have a match." He sat down. The sample from the Carver property fence rail is consistent with the sample from the Beaumont coffee cup. Given the quality of the 1991 sample, we can state with a high degree of scientific confidence that these 2 samples share a common biological contributor. "How high?" Hollis asked. A pause. The probability that these samples do not share a contributor, given the markers we were able to analyze, is less than 1 in 100,000. Hollis thanked him, hung up, and then did something he had not done in this case in 3.5 years. He called Sandra Carver. He had made this call, or versions of it, many times before. Usually to tell her they had something, and then, eventually, to tell her it had come to nothing. She always answered the phone the same way, a little too fast, a little too steady, the voice of someone who had been braced for a call for so long that the bracing had become her resting state. This time he said, "Sandra." We have a DNA match. We have a witness who put a specific individual at the scene. We have employment records that place him in the area. We have physical evidence on his body consistent with the entry method to your yard. We have enough to bring him in." The silence on her end lasted a long time. Then, "Do you know where Michael is?" He closed his eyes. "Not yet," he said. "But we are going to find out." Carl Beaumont was arrested on March 8, 1995, at his mobile home outside Mill Creek, Ohio. He was charged with abduction and unlawful restraint. Investigators simultaneously executed search warrants on his residence, his vehicle, a newer white cargo van, same type as the one he had driven for Caswell, and a storage unit he had been renting since 1993. The search of the residence produced nothing immediately relevant to Michael Carver. It produced other things: photographs, documents, correspondence, that deepened the picture of who Carl Beaumont was in ways that the investigators had begun to suspect but had not yet confirmed. He had a history that had never manifested as a conviction, but that existed in fragments across multiple states: a child endangerment complaint in Indiana in 1988, withdrawn when the family moved away; a restraining order filed and then dropped in Kentucky in 1990. The kind of dark peripheral record that a careful, patient predator could accumulate without ever crossing the line that put them in a database. The storage unit was more significant. Among the items catalogued from the storage unit was a box containing children's belongings. Investigators documented the contents meticulously. Among those contents was a small stuffed animal, gray, worn, missing one eye. An elephant. Detective Hollis, reading the inventory list, had to put the paper down. Beaumont's interrogation lasted 11 hours spread across 2 days. He maintained his innocence through the first day with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this. His story evolved incrementally the way guilty stories evolve, each denial slightly narrowing, slightly retreating from the previous one, as evidence was introduced and positions became untenable. By the morning of the second day, when Hollis placed in front of him the DNA analysis, the witness account summary, and the photograph of the stuffed elephant from the storage unit, the practiced calm was gone. Beaumont looked at the photograph of the elephant for a long time. He did not confess. He would never fully confess, which is one of the most agonizing facts of this case. But he stopped denying. "Where is he?" Hollis asked. "Carl. Where is Michael Carver?" Beaumont looked at the table. "Carl. This child's mother has been waiting for 3.5 years. Where is he?" What Beaumont said next, what came out in fragments over the following 3 hours, in a series of partial, evasive, incomplete disclosures that investigators and prosecutors would spend months making legal sense of, I'm going to tell you carefully, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to tell, and the part you most need to hear. Michael Carver, when investigators following Beaumont's partial disclosures finally located him in April 1995, was alive. Let me say that again, because I know what these cases usually come to, and I know what you've been bracing yourself for through the last 40 minutes of this story. He was alive. He was 6 years old. He was living under a false name, Timothy Cross, in a small town in western Pennsylvania, approximately 220 miles from where he had been taken. He was being raised by a woman named Dorothy Beaumont, Carl Beaumont's older sister, who had been told by her brother in the summer of 1991 that the boy's mother had died in an accident and that he, Carl, was the child's father and could not care for him alone. Dorothy Beaumont was not a monster. She was a childless woman in her late 40s who had been told a monstrous lie by her brother and who had, in believing it, kept a stolen child for nearly 4 years. The extent of her knowledge and her culpability would be debated in courts for the following 2 years. But in the essential fact of who she was to the boy she knew as Timothy, she had taken care of him. She had fed him. She had kept him warm. She had read to him and enrolled him in school and taught him to tie his shoes and held him when he cried, which in the first months after August 1991 he had done often. She had loved him in the terrible, tainted, stolen way that it is possible to love something that was never yours to love. When investigators arrived at Dorothy Beaumont's house in Claysburg, Pennsylvania, accompanied by a child welfare specialist and a victim's advocate, Timothy Cross was in the front yard. He was 6 years old. He had dark eyes and a wide, easy smile, and he was, at the moment they arrived, doing something with a garden hose that appeared to be equal parts purposeful and aimless. The child welfare specialist later said she had seen photographs of Michael Carver at age 2, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same smile, something in the way he moved. They brought him inside, and they spoke with him gently, with the careful patience of people who understood that what was about to happen to this child's world was enormous, and that it had to be handled with extraordinary care. "What was his name?" they asked. "Timothy," he said. "Did he have another name, from when he was very little?" He looked at them for a moment with those dark eyes. Then he said something that the child welfare specialist wrote in her report that same day and would recount for years afterward. He said, "My old name. From before. It starts with M." He had been 26 months old when he was taken. He had been Timothy Cross for nearly 4 years. And somewhere, in whatever deep vault of self children carry, in whatever place the first things about ourselves are stored, he had held on to the fact that his name started with M. The reunion between Michael Carver and his mother Sandra took place on April 14, 1995, at a child welfare facility in Pittsburgh. It was managed by a team of specialists, child psychologists, trauma counselors, family advocates, who understood that a reunion after this length of time and under these circumstances was not a simple matter of mother and child running toward each other across a room. It was a beginning of an extraordinarily long, complicated, and uncertain process of rebuilding something that had been broken in ways not yet fully understood. Sandra had been told on April 10th, when investigators were confident enough in the identification to make the call. She was not, in that moment, able to speak. She sat on the floor of her kitchen, and her sister Patrice sat with her, and they did not say anything for a long time. She asked one question, finally, "Is he okay?" She meant it in more ways than one, and the advocate on the phone understood all of them and answered as honestly as she could. "He's healthy. He's physically well. He's going to need a lot of support and patience and time. But he's here, Sandra. He's here." Dale Carver was called separately. He drove 4 hours without stopping. He had not been inside Sandra's house in 3 years. On April 13th, the night before the reunion, they sat at the same kitchen table where they had once made plans about swing sets and 3-bedroom houses, and they talked for the first time in a long time without the wall of not knowing between them. They were not going to be together again, not in the old way. Too much had changed. Too much of their younger selves had been burned away by 3.5 years of grief. But they were going to do this together, whatever it required. Whatever it required. The reunion itself, I want to be careful with how I describe this, because I was not there, and the details of it were shared only in fragments by the people involved, over years and in careful contexts. What has been described publicly is this. The specialists brought Michael into a room that Sandra was already in, and they had prepared him as much as it is possible to prepare a 6-year-old for something of this magnitude. They had told him that his real name was Michael, and that his mother had been looking for him for a very long time, and that she loved him very much and was going to be there, and that everything was going to be okay. Though of course nobody can promise a thing like that to a child and fully mean it, because okay is a very long road, and they were only at the beginning of it. Sandra was sitting on a couch, because someone had had the good sense to understand that you don't stand at a moment like this if you don't have to. She was holding herself very still. She had been holding herself very still for a long time. He came into the room. He was wearing a blue sweater. His hair had grown longer than it was when he was 2, and it had lightened slightly, but his eyes were the same dark, watchful eyes that looked out from the photograph that had been on news broadcasts and missing persons flyers for 3.5 years. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked at her. And Sandra Carver looked at her son. What happened next has been described, by the psychologist present, in a single line of clinical notation that somehow manages to be the most devastating sentence in the entire 1,200-page case file. Subject recognized maternal figure. Physical contact initiated by subject. He recognized her. He went to her. She held him. And that is all I'm going to say about that moment, because some things belong to the people who lived them, and that is one of them. Carl Beaumont was tried in 1996. The charges were kidnapping, child abduction, and unlawful imprisonment. The prosecution's case was built on 4 pillars: the DNA evidence linking him to the fence, Emma's forensic testimony, the employment and vehicle records, and the elephant found in his storage unit, which Dorothy's own testimony confirmed she had seen in Carl's possession when he first appeared with the child. Dorothy Beaumont pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of custodial interference and was sentenced to 5 years probation, a resolution that many people found inadequate and that remained controversial. The prosecutors argued, and the judge agreed, that Dorothy's genuine belief that she had been acting in a child's best interest, however terribly misled, placed her in a different moral and legal category than her brother. Whether you agree with that assessment is a question this story does not pretend to settle. Carl Beaumont's defense tried 3 things in sequence, as defense teams do when the evidence is overwhelming. They challenged the DNA analysis, arguing that 1991 technology was too limited to be conclusive. They challenged Emma's testimony, arguing that a memory from 20 months of age was inherently unreliable. And they challenged the chain of custody of several pieces of physical evidence. None of it worked. Dr. Michelson testified for the prosecution for 2 full days. She was devastating. She didn't argue against the general science of child memory limitations. She was too rigorous for that. She argued instead from the specifics of this case, the spontaneous nature of Emma's disclosure, its internal consistency, its corroboration by withheld evidence that Emma could not possibly have accessed. She walked the jury through, point by point, the things Emma had described that no one had told her, and that proved to be accurate. When she finished, there was a silence in the courtroom that the court reporter noted in the transcript as lasting 45 seconds before the judge cleared his throat. The DNA experts from the state lab and a private firm hired by the prosecution testified that the probability of the fence rail sample and the Beaumont coffee cup sample not sharing a contributor was less than 1 in 140,000. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Carl Beaumont was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 35 years without the possibility of parole. He has never, to this day, offered a complete accounting of his actions, his motivations, or the full extent of what happened in the period between August 18, 1991, and the moment investigators found the boy he had stolen. There are pieces of those 4 years that remain in shadow. And that shadow does not go away simply because justice, in its legal form, was served. Justice was served. It is not the same thing as wholeness. It has never been. Michael Carver's reintegration into his family and his original identity was a long, nonlinear, intensely human process that he and his family have allowed to be described only in the broadest terms, and that I am going to respect. What can be said is this: he knew who he was. He knew his name. The family, working with a team of child trauma specialists over the following years, helped him rebuild the lost architecture of his early childhood. His name, his grandmother, his parents, his home, the red ball and the stuffed elephant, and the backyard where he had been sitting in a patch of afternoon sun when the world had come apart. Gray the elephant was returned to him. He had not seen it in 4 years. He was 6 years old when he saw it again. He held it for a long time without saying anything. The transition was hard in ways that no specialist's guidance could fully buffer. He had been Timothy for nearly 4 years, nearly 2/3 of the life he consciously remembered. He had relationships, habits, and a sense of self built on that identity, and the dismantling and rebuilding of personhood is not a thing that happens quickly or cleanly or without cost. Sandra had to learn a child she had missed entirely from ages 2 to 6. Dale had to do the same. Michael had to learn people who loved him desperately and whom he was supposed to love back, for whom he felt, at first, something closer to obligation than love, which is an honest thing to admit and a painful one. Love built itself. Slowly. The way most real things do. Dale and Sandra did not remarry. They remained close in the particular way of people who have survived something enormous together and who will never not understand each other because of it. They attended school events together. They had dinners at the same table for holidays. They were not what they had been, but they were something. Emma grew up knowing what she had done, but not in a way that was ever made to feel burdensome. Her parents were careful and deliberate about how they framed it to her as she got older, not as Emma the hero who solved the case, because that kind of framing puts a weight on a child that no child asked for and no child should carry, but simply as something she had seen, something she had told the truth about, something that had mattered. She was not unusual for seeing it. She was exactly a normal 20-month-old who had been present at a terrible thing and who had, 3 years later, found the words to say what she saw. That was all she had done. That was everything. She and Michael remained cousins, which means they remained tangled together in the ordinary and extraordinary fabric of a family, seeing each other at holidays, growing up in adjacent orbits, developing the separate personhoods that adult life produces while maintaining the invisible thread of shared origin. What their relationship is now, in adulthood, is their own. Dr. Patricia Michelson continued her work on child memory and went on to help design the forensic interview protocol that became the training standard for law enforcement in 14 states. She cited the Carver case in her work more than once, not as a solved mystery but as a proof of concept. That children remember. That their memories, approached with the right care and the right patience and the right respect, contain truths that cannot be found anywhere else. Ray Hollis retired in 2003. At his retirement party, one of his colleagues stood up and said that if you went through Ray's desk drawer, you would find, among other things, a single index card with 5 words on it in Ray's handwriting, and that the card had been there for 12 years and had never been thrown away. The card said, "Children don't need to understand to remember." He had written it at a seminar in the summer of 1991, before Michael Carver disappeared. Before any of this, he had just kept it. I want to end this not with a summary. You've been with this story for a long time, and you don't need a summary. You know what happened. What I want to end with is this. Most cold cases go cold because of absence. An absence of physical evidence, of witnesses, of information. The people who know what happened don't talk, or they're dead, or they were never identified. The cases go quiet and they stay quiet, and the families carry not knowing for the rest of their lives, and the rest of us move on to the next thing while they do not get to move on. What made the Michael Carver case different was not a technological breakthrough. It was not a new database, a new forensic technique, a new law that compelled a witness to come forward. It was a 5-year-old girl, sitting at a kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, who picked up a red crayon and remembered something. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. Here is the thing that I think is actually the most important part of this story, and the part most worth sitting with. Emma didn't remember it on that Tuesday afternoon. She had been remembering it since August 18th, 1991. She was 20 months old, and she watched a man carry her cousin over a fence and put him in a white van, and she encoded that memory with the complete, unreasoning precision of a child's observation. The red shirt, the black hair, the quiet crying face, the wince when his hand hit the fence rail, and she held it. For 3 years, in the dark, without language for it, without context for it, without any adult ever thinking to provide her with a moment to say what she had seen. She held it, and when she finally had the words, she used them. Without drama, without strategy, in the completely matter-of-fact way that children deliver the most shattering truths, as if they assumed you already knew, as if they were just confirming something obvious, as if the world they were describing was the same world you had always been looking at together. I remember when the man took Mikey M.O. She had always remembered. She had just finally been old enough to say it out loud. There is something in that fact that I find almost too much to hold. That the answer was there the whole time. That it had been sitting in the memory of a 20-month-old child who was present at the scene, who watched everything happen, who filed it away in that deep wordless archive that young children carry, and that for 3 years, while detectives followed hundreds of leads and parents fell apart and grandmothers wrapped Christmas presents for a child who wasn't there, the witness was growing up 2 towns away, learning to talk, learning to write, learning to be human, getting slowly closer to the day when she would sit down at a kitchen table and say the thing that had been true all along. 3 years, 2 towns, 1 child growing into the words she needed, and a man named Hollis who had kept an index card, and a detective who had kept a biological sample in a freezer when he had no reason to believe it would ever matter. and a DNA technology that was not good enough in 1991 and was barely good enough in 1994 and was just good enough in 1994 to do what needed doing. And a psychologist who had built a career on the belief that children's memories are not nothing, that they are not fictions, not artifacts, not things to be dismissed because the child was very small or very young or did not understand what they were seeing. All of these things converging, eventually, slowly, like the pieces of a puzzle that does not know it's a puzzle until suddenly it does. And a boy in a blue sweater walking into a room and recognizing his mother. That is what this story is. That is what all of these stories are, underneath the cold case language and the detective work and the forensic science. People. People waiting. People remembering. People keeping index cards and frozen samples and wrapped presents under a tree, just in case, just because throwing them away would mean letting go of the possibility, and some possibilities are worth holding forever. Michael Carver is alive. He is an adult now. He has a name that is fully his. He has a grandmother who still talks about how his laugh sounds like bells shaking in a jar. He has a stuffed elephant with one eye. And he has a cousin named Emma who picked up a red crayon one Tuesday afternoon and said what she had always known, and changed everything. That's the story. Thank you for watching.